Episode 18, Soucouyant, a Caribbean supernatural tale. Llega la Conciencia. In the previous episode, the Soucouyant elaborated on her nature to Margarita. In the current episode, the Soucouyant, Margarita, and Mrs. Lee continue the conversation in the back office. Margarita and Kaiwa exchanged glances, and Kaiwa smiled approvingly at Margarita. Margarita beamed. Mrs. Lee did not let on that she noticed the exchange. She surmised that Margarita was familiar with Kaiwa because Kaiwa must have visited the store on different occasions. Mrs. Lee chided herself for not being more involved with the business, but taking care of the children and making the house comfortable and presentable required so much of her time. Nonetheless, Toiser should have mentioned that his cousins sometimes visited the store. She ate in silence with her thoughts. She had heard rumors about how her husband treated his female employees, and for an instant wondered if Kaiba was involved with activities that started the rumors, as an accomplice or a victim. She kept eating and observing them, analyzed the ledger. It was clear that Kaiwa was the teacher and Margarita was the student. She gently pushed the last bite of mian bao into her mouth and wiped her fingers on a napkin as she sat chewing. She looked around and saw the electric kettle. She checked that it had water and flipped the switch to turn it on. "I'm boiling water for tea. Would you ladies like some?" she asked. "That would be wonderful," replied Kaiwa. "I like iced tea during the day, but Margarita drinks hot tea no matter the time of the day." As Mrs. Lee looked more fully at Kaiwa, she knew that Kaiwa was not an accomplice or victim of what she heard about her husband. She sensed the strength in Kaiwa that fine, delicate features could not obscure. She said, "Kaiwa, I wish Tony had mentioned you more. I would have visited the store more frequently." "He didn't? That rascal," replied Kaiwa. I actually feel bad that I didn't make myself take more interest in the business." "Oh, sweetie, I wouldn't feel badly if I were you. Your kids are at important ages. Let me see if I remember. Your daughter, Jasmine, is preparing for CXC exams, and you're getting the boy, Anthony, ready for SEA. Isn't that right?" "Yes, that is correct. I guess Tony does pay attention to tell you all that." Margarita laughed out loud and said, "You are not serious. I'd be surprised if Mr. Lee knew the names of your children. I'm willing to bet he doesn't know how many children he has." "Margarita, be nice. Jenny has too much on her plate right now to be adding more," said Kaiwa. No, it's okay," said Mrs. Lee. "I've heard talk, but blocked it out. I think I should have paid attention." "You are right, Kaiwa. I'm sorry for bringing up that subject right now," said Margarita contritely. No. I want to know how many stepchildren I do have," said Mrs. Lee forthrightly. Kaiwa was surprised and said, "Jenny, you shock me. I never expected that attitude." They were both facing Mrs. Lee, who responded, "I'm a big woman. I expect men to be, well, men. I had hoped Tony would have been more discreet, but I won't reject any children. Children didn't ask to come. We have to go and bring them." Kaiwa looked at Margarita and Mrs. Lee with a big smile on her face. Humans still had the capacity to surprise her. She said, "Well, I'm very impressed with your attitude, but there will be time enough for that." "What do you mean?" asked Mrs. Lee. Margarita answered, "Mr. Lee will come to the store any moment now. He'll want to look through the ledger and get some cash to return to the Chinese Association for the night." "He will? How does that work?" asked Mrs. Lee. "He comes in like it is morning and greets everybody and studies the ledgers," said Margarita. Then I will have a talk with him." "You could try," said Kaiwa. But he's single-minded when he gets here. He may not hear a word you say. You think so? Replied Mrs. Lee. I'm not as accommodating as I look. Ask Jasmine and Anthony. You might be a lioness, but this is a different kind of animal than you ever met, responded Kaiwa. Oh, Gom, you're frightening me. What will I do? Said Mrs. Lee. Don't be frightened. Just be patient, said Kaiwa. What happened to him? Asked Mrs. Lee with rising anguish in her voice. Who can say? Maybe the power of conscience catches up with a person. I remember some indigenous people were selling trinkets in the market in Antigua. Wait, indigenous people in Antigua? Asked Margarita. I'm sure there are descendants of indigenous people in Antigua, but I'm talking about Antigua, Guatemala. I visited there some years ago, said Kaiwa. You took a vacation? Asked Margarita. Not a vacation exactly. I had some business to attend, said Kaiwa. Oh, okay, said Margarita. Anyway, I was watching them sell trinkets to tourists. The tourists were all white, as in Caucasian or Chinese. In walked a tall black man. One of the women said to the others, Ay, llega la conciencia. The conscience arrived, and they all laughed out. Why did they say that? Were they racialists? Asked Margarita. No, they were probably not racist or racialists, as you say. They were more concerned about their tribe, language. I don't understand. How did their conscience catch up with them? Asked Margarita. In their case, not much. They knew the mud trinkets they were selling were not worth the quetzales they charged, and they did not really affect the lives of the tourists wandering about in the ruins. The tourists knew they were being overcharged and were okay with it. It was a tacit agreement. I still don't understand, said Margarita. Well, both were aware of the game and played it, but by acknowledging the man as their black consciences, they did acknowledge the power of conscience, its ability to affect how each person punishes himself or herself. As Kaiwa spoke, she was watching Mrs. Lee closely. Mrs. Lee was following, switching from Kaiwa to Margarita and back again. Oh, said Margarita, the mind is powerful. Tao Itza is punishing himself? Asked Mrs. Lee. Maybe, Kaiwa said. He believes he's getting what he deserves? Said Mrs. Lee contemplatively. Maybe, said Kaiwa. He asked for this and he got it? Said Mrs. Lee. Maybe, said Kaiwa. My poor Tony, he's such a jackass sometimes. He was a good man when we met. He was hard-working and really concerned about the treatment of Chinese people in this country. How were the Chinese people treated? Asked Kaiwa. He felt that Chinese people were not really treated right, like they were not treated with respect like other Trinidadians, not accepted. As Chinese, as part of the fabric of the country, of the culture, Mrs. Lee explained. Sounds complicated, observed Kaiwa. Complicated is right, said Mrs. Lee. Chinese all over the world want the same thing, I think. They want to be distinctly Chinese and completely belonging to whatever country they find themselves in. I tried to explain to Tuha Utsa that he can't have it both ways and not to be angry with Anthony and Jasmine. Why was he angry with the children? Asked Kaiwa. Because they consider themselves Trinis and only Trinis. Their Chinese appearance is about as significant as the color of their hair or eyes. For Anthony, not even that. As long as he could play cricket, he doesn't care about anything else, even his schoolwork, replied Mrs. Lee. Sounds like normal, healthy teenagers to me, said Kaiwa. Tuha Utsa felt they were rejecting him, Mrs. Lee asserted. He was angry, Kaiwa volunteered. Not angry exactly. Well, maybe more than angry. Bitter. He was. Maybe is upset with me for the way I raised them when it comes to people, said Mrs. Lee. In what way? Asked Kaiwa. Well, my parents raised me to deal with everyone, regardless of skin color or hair texture. They had a shop and maintained that honest people came in all colors, shapes, and sizes. And crooks, too. She paused while the other two chuckled in agreement. So I raised them the way I was raised. Besides, they have friends from all communities in this country. Chinese, Indian, African, white, whether Portuguese, Syrian, Lebanese, from all over Woodbrook, St. James, Port of Spain, Belmont, Cascade, Digo, Carenage, Laventille, Chiguanas, even San Fernando. She actually seemed to be ticking off students as she called where they lived. Monkey Town, suggested Kaiwa. Monkey Town? Where's that? Asked Mrs. Lee. Oh, Monkey Town. That's by Barakpur, said Kaiwa. Margarita looked at Kaiwa quizzically, but Mrs. Lee continued as if she just had to complete her exposition. For all I know, they have friends from all kinds of places, even in the country down there. So, I don't understand how Tony expected me to raise them Chinese. You sound as if you know these children, said Kaiwa. I know them, The mothers know all about the other kids. You have to be active in school so they know they can't get away with anything, she said. Who, the school? Asked Kaiwa. No, the children. They know the teachers know us parents, who are always on the spot, and the teachers let the children know we're keeping an eye on them, so they better behave, she explained. Oh, you're in the PTA? Asked Kaiwa. And organize events, said Mrs. Lee. How about Tony? Was he involved? Asked Kaiwa. Not really. No, not at all actually. He was always criticizing, she continued. At first, I thought he was just complaining, like every father and any other businessman. They're not doing enough of this, that, and the other, said Mrs. Lee. And what did he do? Did it help? Asked Kaiwa. Not really. Then he would turn on me. So to avoid argument, I would just leave him to stew and cool down on his own, said Mrs. Lee. Did he? Asked Kaiwa. Eventually, he had to, because I was not taking him on. I just focused on the house and the children and left him to his annoyance or anger or whatever was stuck in his craw. Je ne sais pas. Mrs. Lee paused as her voice caught in her throat. Maybe I shouldn't have. I could have helped him. Tears welled up in her eyes. He started taking advantage of people, of his workers. Maybe it was my fault. He is like this. The tears spilled from her eyelids and ran down her cheek. Or maybe he would have started physically abusing you, said Kaiwa. You said you're a big woman and you don't blame others for things they can't control, yes, I live by that, said Mrs. Lee. Exactly. You didn't blame the children he might have fathered, said Kaiwa. Mrs. Lee winced at the statement, but steadied herself and said, Of course not. Yet, you want to blame yourself for his choices, his actions. Mrs. Lee smiled and wiped her cheek. Margarita sat still and quietly observed Kaiwa interact with Mrs. Lee. She would no more interrupt Kaiwa than interrupt the Prime Minister. In the following episode, Mrs. Lee tells the Soucouyant and Margarita that she still loves her husband. Something about the unconditional love resonated with the Soucouyant. However, the fate of Mr. Lee was still uncertain. He visited the store that afternoon. He was jovial and seemed resolved to serve his penance.